More music on trendybeats.com.
We should start. I hope everyone can hear me. Please, can you? Okay, yeah, thank you. So,
yes, we
good
can.
afternoon. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. We're grateful that you're able to join us for the inaugural roundtable that we are hosting with our center that is taking off, the Center for Research on African Digital Policy and Innovation. So we're trying to start our operations both in South Africa and Nigeria at the moment. And the aim of the center is to focus on the education and research as regards technology and innovations within the African continent, as well as the diaspora, but focused on Africans. So our impact is to embed Africa within the crave for digital futures as we embrace the age of the Internet of Things. And so we want to start by building capacity, which is one of the purposes of this roundtable, for all relevant stakeholders on the state of the art in terms of policy-making processes and technological innovations as it happens globally and as well as on the and as it's specific to the continent of Africa. We're also aiming to be able to provide solutions and technical support to governments and regional bodies in helping them to embrace inclusive approaches to the development of technology, and which also includes creating access to people in marginal communities. So we're hoping to engage with network of scholars, and I tell you, those that were brought on our platform today are men, as we say in our own climb, of timber and caliber. Men and lady of timber and caliber. So sorry for that, who are going to help us deliver on this. And today, we're also aiming during this program to share the report that we've been able to come up with in terms of how you can build digital exchanges in a world that is embracing digital currency now. So I think that is about that for the center. We are still working on our website, which is going to be on any moment from now. But we are active on other platforms on social media at CrackP. We're going to put our YouTube channel live after this program, and also we're on LinkedIn. So you can always engage with us and follow our program on all of these platforms. Without further ado, I welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to today's event, which is a roundtable discussion on managing data breach vulnerabilities within African digital markets. This, I must say, is part of the innovation of our center for a process of engaging with all stakeholders. We've started this particular event, the African Digital Policy Series, which is where we're going to be discussing policies and their implementation as they apply to technology, innovations, and allied concerns within the African continent. So without further ado, let me try to introduce the panelists who are well versatile and most of whom I have relationships with. So in trying to be gender responsive, we actually look for more women, so don't accuse us of not getting more female panelists. But let me introduce Ms. Gloria Nkushi of Intertech Development, who I've been fortunate to work with closely. She's a close friend who is from Zimbabwe, lawyer by profession, and I'm looking forward to our own perspective on data breaches and how we can manage them. And I'm sure she may touch on the legal dimensions of this, but also from whichever perspective she speaks to. She is the founder of Interdev Consulting based in Kenya, but also operating in Netherlands and I think in Zimbabwe. So you're welcome to the platform, Ms. Nkushi. Next, we'll introduce Dr. Samuel Oyewole, who is a lecturer at the Federal University in Oye, Ado-Ekiti in Nigeria. I think he is a political scientist and has done a lot of work on security across the African continent. He's an expert when it comes to discussing terrorism, cybersecurity, in terms of their gadgets, the actors, the networks, and all allied stuff as regards terrorism on the continent of Africa. You can check him out on Google Scholar. He's got a lot of work here, as well as our last panelist, Professor Kingsley O'May, who is based at the University of West Scotland. My own godfather, for real, you know. We've known for decades now, and is a business strategist. He wears many feathers. He's a banker by excellence, someone who is also integrated into African studies. He's worked on trust and institutions. So he navigates, different aspects of what we want to discuss today. So I can promise you that we're going to have a highly engaging interaction on this platform today. So I welcome you all, and we've taken much of your time already. So without extending this further, I would like to invite our first female panelist. So this is the structure that we're going to use in order just to be clear from the onset. We're going to have our discussants give us introduction about their own perspectives, perhaps their work on the topic of the day, which is managing data vulnerabilities within the African digital market, for maybe 10 minutes. Then we'll try to engage them on some questions based on this presentation. Then we'll open the floor to the audience. We are hoping that we'll make this as interactive as possible. And then we look forward to having an engaging session. So thank you very much. So without further ado, I would beckon on Ms. Nkushi to put on her camera if she can oblige us and make a presentation. I think you can share your screen now. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, that's fine. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Philip, for the invitation as well as the introduction. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be involved in today's discussions. I'm going to go straight into it. So actually, before I do that, let me see if I can share my screen. And you could just let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, it's coming up. Yeah, it's on. It's up now.
Okay. So again, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me at the Center for Research on African Digital Policy and Innovation. The topic today is quite broad and it's quite interesting. And I've had a look at the work that the institution has been doing. So I'm going to try and stick within the 10 minutes. I'll just do an introduction to just myself and what perspective I'm coming from, African digital markets, digital access across the continent, and then we'll go into data breaches and necessary policy adjustments from my perspective. I'm an international lawyer. I specialize in human rights and gender, but I work in intergovernmentalism. And so today's presentation is really going to focus on the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is the agreement that is Africa-wide, all 54 nations across the continent, although I do take into consideration that my experience is primarily from SADC, the 16 countries in Southern Africa, as well as the 6 countries in Eastern Africa, because I work in COMESA, which is the common market for the two. I've noticed that most of the panelists are from West Africa. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say from that perspective that is localized. But as far as today's presentation will go, my perspective will be covering the entire continent. It's really going to just touch upon issues and opportunities that are presented by the free trade area with regards to data breaches across the continent. So if we talk about our African digital markets, an overview of those markets is it's a $115 billion industry. Although it sounds like it's a lot of money, it actually is only a very small proportion of the continent that is benefiting from this digital revolution. In North Africa, we have Egypt, which is the leader. In Southern Africa, we have South Africa. East Africa is spearheaded by Kenya, and of course, Nigeria, the continent's largest economy, the continent's most populous nation, is also in the top 4 countries that are actually considered digital, participants in the digital revolution. Now, those are 4 countries. The continent has 54. So those 4 countries collectively make up only 32% of the population. That's less than 1 in 3 Africans. And yet 50% of Africa's GDP is in those 4 countries. The consideration in terms of what does data breaches, how does it affect the continent? It is very restricted because of the small proportion of Africans who actually do have access to digital markets. That's either e-commerce, trade, or importantly, mobile banking, telecommunications, and other internet services. 51% of mobile connectivity is only in those 4 countries, and 50% of the development, the Google workshops, they're in Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Namibia, not broadly spread across the continent. So innovation and investment in the aforementioned 4 countries is more than half of it is taking place in those 4 countries, and then the rest of the continent is sharing that other 50%. Only 33% of Africans, so that's 1 in 3, has access to a mobile telephone. So the biggest challenge to data breaches is that what are we talking about when we think of data? What are we talking about the digitization of data? I think that from me, who's based in East Africa, based in Kenya, and many of you who are based in Nigeria, it's incomprehensible to imagine what your life would be without Jumia, what your life would be without Uber Eats, or all these without the mobile money, the cash apps, all those things. But actually, for the average African, access to digital information as a start is near non-existent, let alone the mentality that we need to be able to know and have ownership over our digital data. Anything that is digital across the continent is owned by our governments. And as I'm sure the other panelists will affirm, it's not just that it's owned by our governments, but it is stored outside of the continent, making it much more vulnerable. So when we go into what access do Africans have, what digital access do they have, there's internet usage, so being able to sign up for a home internet connection, Wi-Fi, broadband, even dial-up, or using mobile data. The differences between gender, youth, and urban and rural inhabitants are overwhelmingly skewed against women, against young people, and against those who live in cities. This is problematic because these are the majority of the population of Africans. Not only are we not participating in digital economies, but we have no say and no ownership over our data. And that means that we have no say and input in the policies that should be designed to protect us. Compared to the world, where 76% of men use internet access, only 50% of African men have internet access, and these are in cities. 39% of women in the rest of the world, and only 15% of African women. Yet African women make up to 53% of the population of the continent. So what this has resulted in with regards to African digital data policies, sorry, let me go back to that again. Sorry, let me try and go back to this slide. Okay, if we go to our African digital policies, every African country has their own legislation. Much of it is not codified and most of it is not enforced. What is enforced are the agreements where our data is stored, whether it's an e-passport or the details of our mobile telephone line or our home internet or all those kinds of information. It is stored overseas in countries like Israel and within the Western Europe, within the European Union. It is stored by private companies. It is not stored by the governments of these countries. And this means that there's a disproportionate amount of African digital data, a lack of policies on the continent, and then the enforcement mechanisms or the challenging of those breaches needs to take place outside of the African continent, making us as Africans a little bit more vulnerable. We have all seen and experienced the fallout of lots of data breaches. Facebook, for example, Twitter, there's been leaks, there's been hacks, all those things. Yes, we are affected by them. Our economies are improving, that we said 50% of the GDP is from e-commerce and digital trade, our health, our agriculture, our industry. It's all linked to this global system, but we don't have ownership over it. And the small proportion of people who are affected by this digital economy have no say over that. What we hope the African Continental Free Trade Area will do is prompt the African Union to take more of an inclusive approach where there is more enforcement, preferably at regional level, of data policies to make sure that they are not being breached. It is difficult to manage data across 54 countries because they all have different levels of development. Internet access in South Africa compared to, say, Burkina Faso, or internet access in Botswana, say, to compare to the Central African Republic, are almost non-comparable. It would need for the regional bodies to be able to take that stand, as we have seen in other areas, cooperation, and particularly military cooperation, where we've seen that the East African community has advanced above every other bloc by cooperating at an East African level. ECOWAS are increasingly getting closer to harmonizing how they manage things, and there would need to be policies developed at that level that are also accountable at the end of the day to the African Union if we are going to actually benefit from the Continental Free Trade Area. As far as data breaches are concerned, my opinion, and from my background, the lack of African ownership is of our data. It's a human rights issue. It's not just a political issue, and it's not just an issue of lack of resources. It's a human rights issue. And I think this arises from the fact that most of our telecommunications infrastructure is still at the parastatal level. The lack of private enterprise within the digital economy and the digital landscape is a pertinent issue, because whether it is an external corporation, whether it's Google or Microsoft who have access to our data, or it is our government who have access to our data, who are using Huawei equipment or Chinese 4G and 5G equipment, in either way, we are being denied our human rights, our rights to be able to have ownership, to have identity. The reason that there's a lack of investment in enforcing policies and privatizing the telecommunications sphere is that the continent has a human rights record and framework that is outdated. it's archaic, and it's not innovative and adaptable to the needs of the African continent, and in particular to this fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution. So there's nothing that incentivizes local data management, and there's nothing that correlates with other factors that make Africans more susceptible to data breaches. There's a lack of, we don't have any watchdog that polices fake news. We don't have any continental-wide system or framework that could prosecute for breaches of data or for misuse of that data. And then, of course, the lack of education, the general lack of education amongst the continent makes it very difficult for people to catch up with this digital revolution. Given that 70% of Africans don't have access to digital spaces at a start, it isn't surprising that external stakeholders don't really prioritize incorporating human rights approaches to how they deal with Africans in that digital space. So private actors act with impunity, and the onus is on our governments to level the playing field. There is some progress in that area. For example, in 2014, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, they readjusted their national GDP. And by doing that, they factored in the advancement of digital technology and the role that it played in their development. And once you start talking about that in terms of its development, the exchange for outsourcing the points of storage of their national digital data from their nations to Israel, to Western Europe, the World Bank and the IMF were insistent that there was some sort of upgrading of the infrastructure in terms of data protections. And so our approach to economic aid, approach to development, in particular in agriculture, satellite imaging, security, military undertakings, climate tracking, things like rainfall, soil quality, seed quality, vegetation programs. There's now a lot more attention being paid to how are we using digital technology to advance these objectives without exploiting the people who are going to be beneficiaries of that. There's always arguments about neo-imperialism, and of course that's a valid argument, but the alternative is that Africans are not just passive actors. There are many local initiatives. There are many countries that their parliaments have put into place laws about how digital information must be stored. Mozambique's an example, Rwanda's an example, Zambia's an example. They manage increasing access and they provide citizens with that assurance, as well as digital intelligence. There's a lot to do with educating people to encourage them to take a proactive approach to their private data. And that's something that we can put all of these laws in place, but laws are made for people. And if the people who are benefiting from the enforcement of those laws are ignorant of those laws, ignorant of their rights, and ignorant of how to operate within the bounds of the laws, there's a limitation of as to how efficacious those laws can be. So these governments are being proactive, and they're trying to just get ahead of the, to jump the gun, so to speak, so that their citizens are also not just passive actors in that digital revolution. I would say that, Africa is not at the worst that it could be in this area. It's not where we can be, but we have the advantage that we have seen how data breaches have affected more developed nations. And we can learn from those experiences, in particular, given that we still have a very small number of people who are affected and who are using these technologies. I think that the African continental free trade area needs to take a rights-based approach. They need to increase broadband access. Every African government should be incentivized to provide a minimum access to digital technology. And they need to increase citizen awareness by encouraging us to remember that with our democracies comes responsibility, and of course to bring more women, young people, and rural citizens onto the digital economy. So how do we get there? Invest in sectors that encourage innovation and growth at a continental level, incentivize citizen participation and responsibility of democracy at local level as well as regionally, and of course, at the supply chain management level, we need to make sure that our use of digital technology and these innovations is in conformity and in line with how, with ways that respect us as citizens, but also don't keep us in the dark compared to the rest of the world. So just to conclude, there's opportunity and potential for the continent to avoid some of the pitfalls of rapidly unchecked data breaches that accompany the fourth industrial revolution in the West in particular, as digital coverage and the breaches are still minimal. We need to be forward thinking in how we leverage this data sharing in ethical ways that also develop the continent. So I think, Philip, that I've fallen within the 10 minutes. I'll hand the time back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Ms. Nkushi. I think you've touched on very sensitive issues. I love your introduction where you told us how large this market was, $115 million, I guess, and a very small percentage of the population participates because some percentage also, about 30% just has access to mobile technology. I think that's reflected in your slide. So in spite of the large market, you're not able to tap into this because of lack of access. And in terms of access, you mentioned the conventional marginal communities, women, young people, and those that are living within rural communities, as was shown on your chart. And it's important that we also mention the outdated regulations, lack of effective regulations in trying to manage this space. But what I think stood out in your presentation was the ownership. In spite of our presence within these digital spaces, Africa still lacks ownership. And there's a lack of investment in trying to even domesticate or ratify some policies and some digital policies. Even those that have been ratified, we've not been able to domesticate them and make them effective. And this has led to impunity of private actors within this sector. I think you've told us that there are local initiatives that have been made to create access and awareness through education in Mozambique, Rwanda, and Zambia, which I think it's why we're coming together to also see how we can leverage on examples from clients that are doing very rightly. You've also for a right space when you don't know what you're dealing with, when you're not aware of what you're supposed, the advantages that are around you through lack of enough education or capabilities, then you can't even know what rights are being breached, how you can fight for these rights, and even how you can prevent the breaches that could happen. So it's important to build capacity in this aspect. You also told us that there is need to be a robust inclusion, investment, incentivization, and trying to create a smooth process when it comes to digital technology. The last one refers to the supply chain management, of course, which is relevant to the African Free Continental Trade Zone that I know you're very familiar with. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the platform to Dr. Samuel Oyewole to make his own presentation. Dr. Samuel, if you're ready.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss this very interesting topic with on this platform. The subject of data and digital space, cyberspace by extension, fall into the intersection of my research focus, which entails the 5 frontier of security, defense, policy analysis. And other frontier apart from the cyberspace include the air, the land, the maritime domain, and space. And for me, the issue of managing data breach, vulnerability, or security of the digital space for Africa is just like any other frontier of analysis. We have almost similar threats that we can observe in the physical frontier in the cyberspace that can be observed. For instance, we have the like of piracy in the maritime domain. We have similar thing in the digital space. We have the likes of software piracy, as well as we have terrorism physically. We also have cyber terrorism or digital related dimension of terrorism. We have hacking, we have vandalism, just like we have against the physical infrastructure and so many other things that are related to the threat that are related to the issue of data breach or protection in the continent. Data breach is a security violation that occur when confidential, protected, or sensitive data is viewed, copied, stolen, destroyed, intercepted, transmitted, or used without appropriate authorization. And when we look at this definition or concept of a data breach and the vulnerability, we need to first of all identify the actors that are involved in digital world or in digital space or digital market in this case. We have, in like any other market, we have buyers and sellers, the suppliers and the receivers. And at the background, we have the producers and the consumers. And at different junctions, we have threats that can be observed. So data breach or vulnerability of our data can happen either at the consumer side or at the producer side. As identified by the earlier speaker, most of our data are stored, sometimes protected, and the infrastructure used for transmission of this data are generated by outsiders from the outside of the continent in Europe, North America, Asia, especially China, Japan, and recently India. So, and because of this, the idea of vulnerability of the continent when it comes to data is even more pronounced because we are unlike the other frontier of analysis like land, our maritime domain, and the airspace. In this case, we are not in control, or African governments and people are have limited control over the infrastructure used for data transmission, for the storage, and for the protection of this sensitive data that we are talking about. So we have a major players that are expected to step in managing this vulnerability. And at different level, we have individuals that are expected to protect their personal data, especially at individual level. We have organizational level of analysis. Different organizations have responsibility to manage their data. Apart from that, we have the national level, that's the government have the responsibility to manage data. Again, we have a regional level, which is the African or sub-regional like West Africa, ECOWAS, and other institutions across the continent. Apart from that, we have intercontinental level or the global level of analysis. And at different level, we have different threats and different strategy to manage them. Now, at individual level, individuals are confronted with a lot of data breach, either through hacking or on regulated access by either government, private actors, or individuals like us. So at this level, the threat to personal data is pronounced, and it also includes threats to intellectual property of individuals. Going beyond individual level, we have corporations that have much to lose when it comes to data breach. And at this level, we have multiple sectors can be observed to be concerned or to be affected by data breach. That includes the entertainment industry, the banking industry. In fact, my last check shows that 8 out of 10 companies in South Africa have experienced data breach, experienced the data breach in year 2021. And in Nigeria, 71% of corporations that were studied by a recent report shows that they were affected by data breach and experienced cyber attack in 71% in 2020 and 89% in 2021. That shows increase in vulnerability of private companies when it comes to data management and protection of their sensitive and valuable data. The similar thing in Kenya. In Kenya, about more than 140 million cases of cyber attack or related data breach were recorded in 2021 alone. And that shows that this subject of concern cannot be ignored in the security, policy, and governance of African digital space. And as a result of this, we also have national related, at the national level, we have threats to government and data. And this is even more alarming because government have more access to individual data, and allowing such data to be violated or experiencing data breach with such huge amount of data can be a subject of concern. For instance, the like of passport, ID card, the likes of electoral data that are gathered shows that individual has a lot of data that are accessible to government, as well as data from the banking sector. All these things shows that the government have access to a lot of our data, and experiencing data breach can actually endanger a lot of things about government policy program. And for countries experiencing hostility with another country, this can be a subject of interest for students of international relations. Apart from the national level, we have a regional level, because data and the digital space generally involve interconnectivity at the global scale. The regional level of threat cannot be ignored as well, because threats can, we have so many transnational actors across Africa, terrorists, pirates, bandits, and some network of individuals, secret society, and other groups that may be interested in individual data, either for private profit purpose or to advance political and socio-economic interest of their individual or the group that are concerned. And all these things shows that there is a need to emphasize and to prioritize policy that improve data security and minimize or neutralize vulnerability of our various data at various levels. And on this basis, in my opinion, recommendation or how we can manage this data breach, we cannot ignore the levels of analysis that are involved. It cannot be done by government alone or private sector alone. Individuals also have responsibility to protect their data, protect their ATM password, your login PIN, and all those stuff are very important in access to your laptop, your email, and all other places where your sensitive data are stored. Individuals have responsibility through the use of strong password, firewall, authorization, state safe browsing, and location management. In the case of location management, so many people have been tracked using their location, and more threat has been vested on them based on the way they manage their location. So many people, especially in Nigeria recently, have been kidnapped using their social media posts and location management. So this shows that issue of data management is very sensitive. Beyond the data or the economic, it also affects safety of individual, especially in countries like Nigeria and some other African countries. So individuals have a responsibility to protect their data, but beyond individual, we have organizational level of analysis. Organizations that are responsible for collection of individual data, storage and protection have to take this responsibility very serious and protect individual data that are available to them. And this include bank and shopping mall and so many other organizations that are involved in digital space. For instance, we have so many organizations that are less sensitive to their responsibility because the government of various African countries are weak in implementation. And that will also lead us to the national level of analysis. But at the corporate level, there's more need to emphasize this fact that policy and implement policy that are relevant to make sure that there are more safety measures imposed implemented for data management. At the national level, which is of more concern to myself as a student of politics, at the national level, there's a need for policy formulation for some countries that are yet to formulate relevant policy to protect data across Africa, privacy and other data. And for countries that have formulated such policy, there's a need to roll out strategy to implement the policy, because there are so many countries that have policy framework with limited strategic guidance to implement such policy. Besides, many African countries with policy have their policy are not comprehensive enough to protect data. Some policy are just focused on protecting intellectual property. Many African countries don't even have relevant policy or laws to protect intellectual property, as evident in the way we have so many intellectual property of musicians, those in the entertainment, movie. So many of these can be found online without proper law enforcement. So beyond formulation of policy and legislation, there's a need for policy awareness. There's a need for digitalization, education, and campaign. And this particular responsibility transcends the government of the day. There's a need to collaborate with NGOs and the private sector to expand the digital education of individuals and of the general public across African countries as well, so that we can drive home the idea of digital security and minimize the vulnerability of individuals and corporations. And this will also be very important when we integrate our education system into this plan. The curriculum from possibly the secondary or the middle age school, higher institution can address some of these concerns as a general means of educating our population on digital security and minimizing the vulnerability. Beyond awareness, there's a need to also implement policy, emphasize regulation. Sometimes we have policy implementation agency without appropriate or adequate regulation. So there's a need to emphasize regulation. In Nigeria, we have NISTRA as a backbone of digital security for the country. But despite this, there are limited efforts to respond to threats, especially at individual and corporate level. These particular organizations only have much presence at the major city across the country, Why so many other places, there's no one can even observe the presence of some of these organizations, and the activities are less in those areas. So there's a need for regulation and law enforcement. In many cases, across Africa, we had an issue of cyber fraud or digital fraud in relation to bank and other means of other form of fraud. However, there are limited prosecution or arrest that has been made in relation to those that cross the line of the law. So there's need for law enforcement in this area. In Nigeria, we have EFCC, ICPC, we have the police and other agencies that are relevant to law enforcement. But despite this, many internet or digital related frauds still continue without proper investigation, arrest, or prosecution. So, and this also comes to the responsibility of the judiciary. Beyond the legislature that are expected to formulate policy and the executive that are expected to implement, the judiciary also have a responsibility to interpret and adjudicate cases. But however, limited effort has been made in this area in many African countries that have even shown effort towards this area to adjudicate and serve justice when the cases of data breach. And because of this, we continue to experience data breach because of limited capacity of our judiciary to respond to these threats. Beyond that, we have regional level. There's a need for policy harmonization. There's a need for regional collaboration, and there's a need for capacity building for less developed African countries by those that are leading in this space. And beyond the region, there's a need for intercontinental effort through global connectivity and collaboration. And this will help us, especially in the area of infrastructure, in the area of skills, so that we can have globally distributed benefits of digital age. Thank you, at least for now. I'll wait for question and answer time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iwale, for this wonderful presentation. Listening to you, we just can't have enough of that. It's like we should keep going on and on and on and on, but time is not our friend. So I'll try to be brief in summarizing all you've made. I love the fact that you started your presentation by telling us that there are intersections between what happens within digital space and also the physical space as it relates to maritime, land, and air, and where things can be stolen, destroyed, intercepted, or interfered with. So you spoke about piracy, terrorism, hacking, that takes place within both spaces. I love the definition, which is comprehensive enough, which for me is just interference without permission, in the digital space. So whether you are stealing, you're destroying, you are trying to penetrate, for lack of a better term, spaces without permission, then that is breach of data privacy. Now, you now made a distinction between these two spaces. While we in Nigeria or in Africa can say we have control over the physical spaces, land, air, and of course, the sea or the maritime space, we do not have control, like has been said within the two presentations, by the digital space, because we contract out most of these things, and we derive them from outsiders. So you now identify the stakeholders at different levels, of course, the layers of the individual, the organization, the national level, regional and global level, which you touched on. And you now also reflected some sectors that are particularly vulnerable. Education, I think you mentioned banking as well, and you gave us some statistics of 8 in 10 countries in South Africa, 71% in Nigeria that scaled up to 80% in 2021. The 71% was for 2020, or 80% region, And the one in Kenya, which I think is scary, I'm not sure that I heard you right, but I think you said 140 million cases in 2021 alone, of data breaches. I think that's what I heard, So it tells us that this cannot be neglected. And you now spoke about the state and its responsibility. So you want to do anything now because everybody's going digital, you have to submit your data whether through passive aggression or under compulsion, or in whichever way, you just, to function, you need to, submit your data to the state. And so the state has a lot of responsibility, because giving them our data endangers our own privacy. But you have also said these different layers you earlier mentioned are also responsible for the management of data protection itself. And you mentioned responsibility for each and everyone. I don't want to start repeating that, but I love your endpoint in terms of global collectivity and collaboration, harmonization at the regional level. All these things are important to show that these different layers have to intersect in terms of their responsibility for data protection. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Please, you can type your questions within the chat box as we continue. I see a hand up. You can also raise your hand. But that will come after Professor Kingsley Umie's presentation. So you have the platform. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Philip Olayaku, and I think it's a pleasure to be welcome to present today. I don't think I'm as eloquent and knowledgeable as the two previous speakers ahead of me, but I think they've done justice to the topic, and they've been able to actually address some of the major key points which I would have loved to mention. But again, I'd like to say thank you once again for inviting me, and I'll try to stick within the 10 minutes timeline. I think, Dr. Olayaku, I hope you can see my slide on the screen.
Yes, we can. Yes. Okay. Yes, we can see. Yeah.
So I'll pretty much go straight to the thrust of the issue, and I'll be speaking perhaps through a more organizational-led perspective. I think Gloria has done a very great job in looking at it from a very holistic viewpoint, and Dr. Samuel has kind of looked at it from from a government perspective, and in the macro perspective at the government level, a meso perspective at the organizational level, and a micro perspective from the individual level. I think I'd kind of draw more from the organizational perspective and kind of provide some kind of insight into some of the role of policymakers and institutions per se. But I think before I proceed, it's quite important to kind of note that I think for us in Africa, it kind of took us a long time to kind of embrace the effects and the possibilities of the internet. But I think with the advent of the mobile revolution, we've kind of seen that Africa has kind of leapfrog the world in terms of its access to some kind of new transformational mobile products and the services of digital economy. And it's quite apt and apposite to mention that today in Africa, we've got in excess of about 600 million African internet users. And despite the weak institutional infrastructure and arrangements we do have, and one can actually argue that these numbers are actually in excess of what we can actually get in Northern America and parts of the Middle East combined. But again, I think with this advent and with this surge in terms of numbers and this embracing of the internet, it also comes, we've also come to see a lot of challenges in the sense that we've come to see the emergence of opportunity hackers and fraudsters determined to find holes in security systems, find holes in government agencies, and of course, find holes in terms of the economic returns when they kind of affect or hack into organizations. And if you look at it from the organizational or digital market perspective, the assumption is that, of course, we do recognize that the internet and information technology will kind of shape the way Africa does business and the global perspective. But the data breaches and the record of data breaches, not just in Africa, but globally, has increased and surged by more than 50%. And if you look at it again in terms of statistics and the economic impact, you realize that if not appropriately curbed, right, the effects and the economic challenges is actually disastrous. But again, I think a telling point is that what we've seen over the years, not just within Africa, but especially in leading institutions across the globe, especially in more mature markets, is that no security apparatus is impenetrable. Because the truth is, as a result of continuous innovation, we've seen that hackers and fraudsters have become more innovative. right? And they've become more innovative to the extent that even the most fortified security networks have been penetrated. Now, in terms of economic figures, what we've seen is that if you look at these breaches across African organizations, we've come to recognize that breaches have kind of accounted to about £3 million, $3 million, right, for organizations. And there is a need to kind of look at how organizations and how markets and how governments can try to limit the effect of data breaches. But again, it's quite important to understand that data breaches can actually be man-made, right? This is associated by malicious attacks, cybersecurity breaches, or it can also be as a result of accidents or weak regulations or technical failures. And in terms of research, I think more research has to be done in terms of addressing these data breaches, monitoring, and looking at the impact on digital organizations and, of course, governments. I think the question for us today is how can we actually manage data breaches and the vulnerability across African digital markets? And for me, I always like to ground my analysis and my thesis on a theoretical underpinning. And I've kind of drawn on the theory of transformative reflexivity, which presupposes an understanding that social behavior or behavior must be located within social and institutional context, so that the knowledge and behavior of every government policymaker or institutions or government agencies, or organizations or individuals ourselves must be grounded on the ability to self-introspect, whereby we're actually looking at the need to understand some of the issues and retrace back to see how we can actually explore possibilities and solutions to eradicating the challenges. And within the context of data breaches and vulnerability, the idea is that the logics of transformative reflexivity ensures that policymakers, federal agencies, and individuals are able to understand the nature of data breaches and try to provide protection behavior or mitigants to protect these breaches going forward. Now, in terms of perspectives, I've done what I call a quick desktop literature review. And what I've come to see is that there are actually three main reasons for data breaches across digital markets, especially as you try to relate it to the African continent. And the three main breaches kind of apply at both the macro level, at the meso level, and the micro level. At the micro level, we find out that at the micro level, we have the role of employees, and across organizations, not just within Africa, but globally, we've come to realize that data breaches are actually done by people within those organizations, the banks, the FCMG businesses, small businesses. It could be current employers or prior employers, or current employees or prior employees, or these data breaches are done by people within the organizations. At the economic level, at the meso level, we find out that the role of hackers. So hackers, most of the data breaches, and I think about 45 or 50% of data breaches has been done by hackers. And this has kind of ensured, this has actually affected the way people do business, the way organizations strive, and policymaking. And the economic hackers are one of the main reasons why we actually have a huge surge in digital breaches in the digital markets. And again, the last part operates at the macro level. Is at the result of policy failure. And I think Gloria and Samuel have eloquently kind of posited the need for strong institutional framework, strong response from institutions and policymakers to kind of address these failures and the need to ensure stronger and more stringent data breaching policies. And I think I've kind of drawn on this extract from a recent study by Dilip et al. And in their journal, they did mention that data breaches can be attributed to the implementation of security policies that are most or least effective. And for policymakers and for organizations, there is a need for more stringent security policies, whereby they're actually able to provide necessary and sufficient training at the macro level, at the meso level, at the micro level, to ensure they're able to enhance and support employees. Now, I think at this juncture, I'd like to kind of draw on a recent report done by Verizon in 2022 this year. And I think this is their 15th annual report, but a very comprehensive one. And what they did was that they analyzed 5,212 breaches in 2021, which are called within organizations spread across 11 vertical markets and, of course, 4 distinct regions. And what they found out were actually 5 telling important findings. I think the first one is that they did find out that across the macro and meso and micro level, that ransomware has actually increased substantially. And the ransom request can actually tag on any breach, right? So the idea is this ransomware continues to be there appears to be a continuous and major surge of ransomware attacks across board. Now, they also found out that one supply chain breach in 2020 was enough to kind of change the dynamics of a given business industry. This kind of demonstrates how one single breach, one single data breach can actually affect number of clients, number of consumers, and it's quite effective for organizations and policymakers to ensure that they actually put in place strong and stringent measures to monitor and defend incidents across board. Now, I think for me, again, one of the key things I did find out was that in their report, there were actually 4 main telling elements, right? The ability for hackers and fraudsters to compromise credentials. I think we're all aware of how the Yahoo syndrome across parts of sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, where you get a lot of phishing emails, the deploying of botnets, and the ability to kind of tap into a victim's credentials. And these things are not new, but of course, they continue to create that significant effect on economic matters and on financial returns. But again, these data breaches cannot be done without the human link. And the reports from Verizon continues to argue that the human element is still the usual weakest link. And without the human element, these data breaches cannot succeed. Because one, the human links ensures that people continue to give access to malicious fraudsters and continue to give way to people, and in doing so, they lose their credentials. But I think the most telling element, again, in terms of the economic element or the economic factor, is the effect of these data breaches on small businesses. Because what we've come to realize is that these cyber attacks have continued to constantly attack enterprises and small businesses within Africa and also globally. And we've come to see that these attacks are enough to kind of destabilize and affect the economics of these small businesses. So there must be a need for organizations and businesses to be on the lookout for indicators that ensures that they are able to mitigate these breaches. A recent attack was actually experienced by Experia. I think Experia is one of the largest largest data breaches we've seen to date. So the idea is businesses must continue to ensure that they actually have indicators to indicators to kind of identify these malicious attacks. So I think in rounding up, the question is, what can African leaders and CEOs do for digital markets in ensuring that they're able to manage data breaches and manage vulnerabilities? I think I've kind of captured them here. One, there's the need for regulations to ensure that these federal agencies can actually make serious but concerted efforts, right? And we've come to realize that a lot of web applications in Africa are susceptible to malicious attacks. So there's a need for more understanding, there's need for more awareness, there's need for more investment about preventative measures. Again, at the organization and policy making and individual level, I just like Samuel did mention that this cannot be done alone by the government. There is a need for a co-creation or co-collaboration whereby everyone takes the initiative to protect their web server environment and ensure they're able to do adequate security testing. Again, if you look at some of the attacks or some of the instances we've had over the years, there's a strong link between those security breaches and the absence of thorough security auditing. So there must be a very thorough security auditing at various levels, at the government institutions, at the federal institutions, federal agencies, organizations and individuals. I've come to see across Africa whereby a number of policy and federal agencies still use the Yahoo as their web domain. And for me, it's quite appalling and quite telling. So one, we need to kind of look at these inherent limitations to ensure we're able to protect and protect our vulnerabilities. What else? I think one of the good things that have come from Africa is the African Union Mechanism for Policy Cooperation. I think the AfriPol is has been a tremendous innovation. But again, there's a need for more empowerment, whereby governments across Africa should empower Afripol to kind of ensure they're able to mitigate the challenges of these malware attacks. But again, there's also a need for those stricter regulations at the country basis and the cross-country basis to ensure that legislative level involvement across the continent are strong and powerful enough to fight the threats of digital breaches. In South Africa, we've got this Cybersecurity Digital Alliance, which is actually a cross-industry network of prominent players, and they've been able to do a great job. We've got the NICTA in Nigeria, but again, there's a need for more. I think one of the challenges I've seen in NICTA, why they do have a lot of prospects and potentials, there's always that issue of ethnocentrism and bias and cultural bias that tends to neglect the ability of strong players or more prominent and more experts who have expertise to kind of take the lead and ensure they're able to act in the best way. There should also be investment in terms of regulation, investment to provide assurance to citizens. The element of trust here is quite important: trust for businesses, trust for individuals, trust for investors. But again, Africa's got lots of potential, so there must be that access for digital services across board, even across the rural areas, create more awareness across the economy, provide incentives, just like Gloria did mention, enhance security across board in line with standard global practices. Perhaps I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take more questions as we go on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor May, for your wonderful presentation. I must confess that I love your intervention, which you made from the MESO level. Our time is fast spent, so I'll just go straight to it to say that you also brought in a new perspective to tell us that in spite of our complaints that some Africans are still within the margins of access to the internet. In terms of access to the internet, we have quite a number, 600 million persons, which is bigger than even those that we can refer to as more developed continents than Africa. And so it's important that we protect this large chunk, from data vulnerabilities. You also told us that it's increased 50% from 2020 to 2022, and that there's no platform that is not susceptible to data breaches. And I love the fact that you also pointed out in your presentation that even small businesses are actually being hacked or being breached, within the digital space. And this shows the drive or the drift towards digitization of the markets, which is why this roundtable, I think, is very important. You reminded us that it's important through your theoretical underpinning of transformative reflexivity to consider the social context, the social behavior when it comes to data protection, which I think other persons have touched on, to say that we don't leave it. The apathy that some of us have when it comes to taking responsibility for our data is something that we need to change in terms of our behavior. And I think other persons have touched on it. I think Dr. Samuel mentioned briefly about the social media. I think one of the trending issues in Nigeria is about the First Lady. I don't think I want to go beyond that because I don't know who is on this platform, but you all understand what I'm saying. To say that, the social media could make people vulnerable, even to state agents. Perhaps we can call it state violence and state terrorism, which must be condemned, at all costs. Yeah, I think that must be said. You spoke about policy failure and weak regulations, which other people have touched on as well. And how the human elements is also a very significant factor. The Yorubas will say, that means if those within do not, slay you, then you cannot die from without. And that means that there are some collaborations in terms of the employees I referred to within organizations with outsiders who violate the digital spaces of this. You also mentioned the importance of managing this data. I think I will touch on your regional initiative to say that there are organizations or institutions like Afripol that have been created, and there is need for more cooperation and trust. I think the element of trust is very important. If we need to trust our government enough to be able to, even submit our data to them. And that's why you have some people giving false information because they don't trust them. But you go to an event, they tell you to write your name, you better write someone else's name because you don't know who you are going to get the next call from, So the element of trust is important in trying to, submit our data, manage our data, and also make them as effective as possible, both, in our personal lives and within the African digital markets. On this note, I would like to thank all our panelists for this presentation. And because our time is fast spent, I think I'll just open the floor to the audience. So Lawa has his hand up quite for a while. Okay, maybe Lawa should ask his question, then I'll take the question in the chat box from Bernard. So Lawa, you can go now, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations, starting from Dr. Gloria, Samuel, and Dr. King. And I will also start by congratulating you because what you've done today is to keep quite a lot of us better informed as regards what the data activity is, and also making us shift away from understanding of security threats from the ordinary one that has to do with militarization and the likes of it. So I appreciate your position and delivery today. However, I have a few points. Number one of it is, yes, the last question, the last statement by Dr. King, where he said he's looking at what African CEOs can do. And then I look at it from the angle, are they enablers or they are benefiting from data breach and activities that I would say? A very quick one I would give is the very common ones where we see people from the financial sector sending messages to people over little data that they have. And then we've saw that it has led some people to a sense of depression and even some committing suicide. When it comes to the financial sector, you take a loan and then they send messages to every member on your contact. And I know that many are not aware of the implication of that and how vulnerable they could be, because most times when people download applications, they just click on yes, 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 and yes. And I also noticed there was a trend on Twitter last week where some people were complaining about your state government. They asked people to put in information for employment, I think agro scheme. And the next thing, they enrolled all of them into Seyi Makinde campaign. And then we look at it. If is it organization that is the problem? Is it the government that should protect our data, or what part of this society are we even looking at? And also, before now, I've always said the National Orientation Agency has not been a responsive government agency. Which of the parastatal and ministry or agency of government are we placing the role of awareness on as it comes to sensitizing the people on to what extent can they release their data? And I know for a fact that people are also enablers in the sense that when you go to social media, you go to Twitter, you see Instagram, you see people making announcements for people to drop in their telephone numbers, their name, their bank information. And people do this without understanding the implication that it can cause them harm. Yeah, it's caused them harm yesterday, today, and even tomorrow. So I understand and I like the approach that this is so holistic. Thank you for continuous deliberation. I will pause here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution. I think the panelists will attend to that. I also want to chip in the question from the chat from Bernard, who is in transit. So he's talking about the need for a central database, which I think is important. I was arguing with someone just a few moments ago at an event where I'm presently on the falsehood when we say that our data is integrated. I think when you say the data is integrated within the central data pool, that means the driver's license number, whatever number, And so I'm thinking when you talk about integration, a number should identify you in all of this, and you should be able to use this number in multiple spaces. And this could also help. I mean, it's two ways. It could make your data more vulnerable once that central platform is breached, or it could also make it more protected if we can invest all our energy in protecting all of these platforms. So we'll take the contribution of Mr. Tony Fashidimi, then return back to our panelists. Thank you very much. Please be brief with your Mr. Fashidimi, please.
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate all the presenters today. Their presentations have been very, very fantastic and enlightening. Well, however, I have one or two, I wouldn't know if I should call them questions or inputs. So when it comes to, the three of them hinted on the human aspect or the social aspect when it comes to data breaches, or if you like, security hacks. And I know they touched on the fact that you can have insiders who actually use their privileges to actually breach information for their own personal gain, which is true. But there is also something that is of concern, because I did a study on something like this too. And I find that aside from all these things that we have mentioned, it is important to focus a lot on, social attacks, because, these hackers or these malicious entities, they are so, how do I put it now? They don't give up. They keep looking for different ways to actually penetrate people. It could be even physically, so that these people can give off sensitive information that will now be a means through which they can now penetrate. So I think that social attacks, how to help people, to grow so that they can, avoid being outsmarted by, these social attack gimmicks from all these malicious hackers, is very, very important. So they might have a good intention, but these people can come and pose as somebody else, or pose as the way you see it in all these social media platforms, or they can take somebody else's identity and then they just pretend, or they can even come physically, and just, they have these different ways of, attacking or penetrating, unsuspecting employees or sensitive people through these social attacks. Since we are talking about Africa, the next thing I want to mention, which is also a question, since we are talking about Africa, we know that one of the major issues in Africa is corruption. So when it comes to cybersecurity or information breach, or even managing information or whatever, you find that to a large extent, it is very important to deal with, corruption. For example, if a system is corrupt and it's filled with so many corrupt people, that has corrupt government, that have corrupt, that have corrupt propagandas, even if you digitize, sometimes it can even make it easier for those governments to manipulate things, whether in terms of breaching people's data or taking people's privacy, or implementing their so-called propaganda, whether it is even rigging elections and things like that. For example, in Nigeria, you see all the stories going about little children being enrolled, people with different names, white people and things like that. That is as a result of corruption. So even though there is a kind of architecture in place and policies in place and whatever, but once the people themselves or the government or the majority, they are corrupt, it will actually make these things useless. So what do you think that can be a way to actually deal with this particular issue as it affects us in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should go in the reverse order. Professor May, Professor Oyewola, and Professor Mbushi. That reverse order, so that.
Well, I'd like to say once again, thank you, Professor Philip. And I think the commentary from Lawa Lola and Fash, and I think that's Fashademi Anthony. I think those comments are pretty much opposite, very relevant and quite timely. Because the truth is, when you look at reports and when you look at data, right, they kind of look at it from a holistic perspective. But I think a very unique way to look at it is, what are the fundamental reasons why we've got these malicious attacks, especially within an African context? I think the issue of looking at the need for to enhance economic growth, because the truth is the lack of economic potentials and lack of economic opportunities has led people to looking at other ways to go into fraud. I think, take for instance the case of our very good friend Hushpuppi, right? So what we're actually seeing is that, one, and also the effect of the pandemic led to what we call a very strong low economic growth. And this has kind of recorded and increased opportunities for criminal organizations. And so people are kind of looking at what are the opportunities to survive, right? How do we commit fraud? How do we attack companies, attack organizations? Now, from the institutional level, the good thing we do have in Africa is that our politicians have not become very savvy enough to start conducting internet fraud and malicious attacks. But one thing they do have that is actually affecting the society, affecting the economy, is what Anthony has quite mentioned, is that element of corruption, whereby, one, we do not have strong institutions or strong institutional infrastructures that checkmate them and provide strong enforcement mechanisms. So, for instance, take for the forthcoming Nigerian elections, whereby we've got data malpractices, we've got underage people being recorded in the as members of the electorate. So, I think two things we need to be addressed here: how do we create jobs, create economic possibilities and economic opportunities, and how do we ensure stricter regulations? In the EU, we have the GDPR that ensures stricter regulations. In South Africa, we have the POPI legislations. These two main bodies that I can actually recall off my head have actually led to a wave of stricter regulation across their countries. Now, why can't we do it in parts of Southern Western Africa and East Africa and North Africa? So there must be that legislative level movement, not just across specific contexts, but across board, across Africa. I think the key is to ensure that there's a collaborative effort towards finding a common ground, to sharing insights, to sharing strategies, to fight the threat of cybercrime. And I think South Africa, for me, in my own perspective, and Kenya are actually doing a great job here. But the truth is, and I'll end at this point, is that these data breaches and hacks will continue to emerge, and there's a strong element that African data security and African cyber responsive is not strong enough to kind of fight the sophistication and the increasing way attacks will continue to come. So a lot of work needs to be done. We need to hear more success stories from Africa to ensure that we are not really affected by the economic challenges from fraudsters and vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. And I really appreciate the comments and the presentation of the two other presenters. They actually cover some of the things that I was unable to actually touch in my presentation. The last presenter, Dr. Kingsley, mentioned the idea of internal involvement of the organization, internal individual within the organization are involved. In most cases, we can broadly categorize data breach into internal or external, and it can be intentional or unintentional. In some cases, some bankers in discussion with their friend may reveal sensitive details about individual that visit their bank regularly. Are you aware that that particular guy is very rich? He has this amount of dollars in his account, and then he or she can even arrange friends to be close to that person. So sometimes these are intentional or unintentional, and this can be covert and overt. And again, I think one other thing that I did not pay more attention to, or that we have not talked much about, is the infrastructure. The infrastructure for communication, the submarine cable, the cables can be tapped into, and apart from that, they can be destroyed. And all these things are sensitive. Again, the satellite support for communication can also be hacked, can be targeted by especially state actors to access sensitive information. Many African countries are now going space. They are looking up to space to support their telecommunication and digital whatever. We have about 50 satellites have been launched by African countries now. So that means we have to pay attention to hacking and how to protect our space and infrastructure as well. Apart from the submarine cables and the land-based cable that are supporting our telecommunication and digital space. And on the issue of corruption, the technology is not corrupt, individuals are corrupt. And the intention the motivation of individual have to be studied properly while looking at why corruption is involved. We have issue of socio-cultural that are also involved, apart from the economic incentive or motivation for corrupt inducement for data breach. We also have socio-cultural. In Africa, we tend to prioritize patrimonial relationship above institutional need. So people place emphasis on friends, family, in releasing sensitive information because they believe that it's my friend, I can actually tell him this information. It's my family member, instead of prioritizing the institutional ethics and rules that guides relevant institutions. Again, the political dimension is there. Many politicians across Africa can do anything to attain the position of power or to remain in power. And as a result of that, they will use every information available in their disposal against their opponent and their followers. And with this digital age, all this information are easily accessible and available. They can be tapped into the EFCC, especially in Nigeria. The EFCC can pursue anybody that is bankrolling opposition party. And again, for the DSS is also there for cases, anybody that is not in support of the sitting government, or all those things are there and easily accessible to the security agency. And it keeps my mind to identify this. At the defense side of this particular breach, in Nigeria, for instance, we have the Space Administration, and the structure of the National Space Administration has a particular unit of that administration dedicated to cybersecurity. So for the defense dimension for Nigeria, many other countries, I'm aware that Kenya also has a unit for their defense and security in relation to, as well as Rwanda and a few other African countries. So, but not all African countries have that unit devoted to defense, especially against external actors, mainly the states and transnational terrorist group in protecting their data and all that. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. So thank you all for the questions, and congratulations as well to Dr. Samuel and Dr. Kingsley for your presentations after mine. I think with regards to the questions, I think that the preceding two panelists have answered most of the questions with regards to whose responsibility is it to manage our data as Africans, whose responsibility is it to make sure that we are not being scammed. I think that Dr. Samuel made it succinct. It's a collective responsibility. Us as citizens have a responsibility to change our mindset and our attitude towards our privacy data. But there's also other actors. Of course, the relationship that most African citizens have with their governments and the history that governments have with their citizens and their use of data makes it quite contentious and quite important that NGOs and community groups and advocates are actually working very hard to sensitize the populace. We all have situations. I mean, I have personal experience. A few months ago, I had to completely redo my ID, my passport, everything, because apparently I'm a different person and I voted for other things. So those kinds of things, when people propose, do you want to put your details in a national database, it becomes quite discouraging. I think that African governments, as far as corruption is concerned, we need to learn how to leverage that corruption. Our governments overwhelmingly tend to respond to incentives. For example, the European Union has incentivized upscaling and making our systems digital, and as Dr. Samuels just mentioned, making sure that we have cybersecurity units. They tie that to aid. They sort of, hold a carrot on a stick to African governments. And the reason, their motive in the European Union is to get all of our data so that they can prevent us from immigrating and going across the Mediterranean Sea to their countries. But African governments are responding by pushing for people to get registered, to get national IDs, national passports, e-passports, so that they can get that aid money in exchange. And that's where there needs to be that holistic approach. We need to work with what we're given, and most of us have been unfortunately saddled with non-transparent and not particularly philanthropic leadership. But that's not an excuse for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. We should also continue to lobby for data protections, like Dr. Kingsley mentioned. In certain countries, you cannot set up an e-commerce business. You cannot set up an Instagram shop, something on Facebook, and just start selling things left, right, and center, taking people's phone numbers and all these kinds of things without first registering with a particular body. And we as citizens need to take that responsibly. We also need to hold people accountable for that. So I think that we are moving in the right direction. There are lots of opportunities and lots of areas, yes, where we could improve. But I think it's key that we collaborate at regional level as well as across the continent, and leverage that legislation, weak as it may be, to build upon it, to expand it, and of course to enforce it. And that's what's very important. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your wonderful submissions, panelists. Just to round up the session, I think our time is fast spent. So we're also just trying slightly to introduce our own offering using this inaugural platform as well. So because of the challenges that abound in the crypto world, we've decided to come out with a smart guide on cryptocurrency. But now we're looking at the innovative aspects of it. How do we try to engage with Africans within a layman's, as lay as we can be, because you still have to use some technical terms, you know, in trying to evolve digital decentralized exchanges. So we came up with this guide, which we call the Smart Guide on Building Scalable Digital Decentralized Exchanges for Africans. And there we talked about what cryptocurrency exchanges are. Then we narrowed it down to features of this decentralized digital exchanges. And we also talked about how one can build an exchange that is scalable over time. So we've shared it while the presentations were going on. And we hope that this could be the first of many contributions that we have in terms of building capacity of Africans within the digital space. On this note, let me thank everyone, starting with the panelists, Ms. Nkushi, Professor Yewale, Professor Kingsley, for joining us. By virtue of your teaching universities, I think you're professors, so within that context, I'm using it. Thank everyone on this platform, especially those that are still here now, for your support always. You know, I will thank Mr. Lawal for his logistics support. And we also thank every person, Mr. Fashidemi, Mr. Bernard, Dr. Edema, I see you there. We're happy to see you. Our latest doctor-to-be, Charles Adeni Shoyobo. So we thank everyone for joining us. And those that we've not met, Mr. Samuel Abdullahi has been here for a while. So we thank you for joining us on this inaugural lecture. We hope to have more engagements in the next year. So watch out on our platforms as, you know, we try to, you know, create an Africa that fits into digital features. So from our own end, we say thank you very much and hope to see you subsequently in all our events. So bye for now and see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Bye, everyone. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Gloria.
Yeah,
bye,
bye.
Samuel. Bye, everyone. Happy to connect on LinkedIn, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, we will look you up. Thank you.